Harlem, New York. 9:13 p.m. Friday, June 5th, 1959. The rain had stopped 20 minutes ago, but 125th Street was still sweating. Steam rose off the asphalt like the breath of something dying. Neon from the Apollo bled into the puddles like spilled blood, casting everything in shades of red and shadow. Inside a smoky back room behind a social club on Lenox Avenue, the air was thick with sweat, gin, and something sharper, ego. At the center of the room stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Dark, tailored suit, pressed with military precision. Hat tilted just enough to say he didn't answer to fashion or to anyone else. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't laughing. He was watching. His eyes moved across the room with the calculated precision of a predator measuring wind resistance before a strike. Across from him, stripped down to a stained white tank, hands taped, jaw clenched, was the man who thought he'd found a shortcut to immortality. Sonny Hammer Doyle, 36 years old. Former light heavyweight contender. Irish, loud, desperate. The kind of man who had tasted applause once and couldn't live without it. The kind of man who didn't understand that in Harlem, after a certain point, the audience you chase can get you killed. 9:14 p.m. The private card game was at full speed. Cigarettes burned down in overflowing ashtrays. Dice clicked against the wall in the next room. Money passed hands in quiet, controlled movements. No one was supposed to be yelling in here. This was neutral ground. Bumpy's ground. Sonny didn't care. He took a long pull from his bottle, wiped his mouth with the back of his taped hand, and looked straight at Bumpy. "You know what they say about you, Johnson?" He slurred, voice slicing through the murmur of conversation. "They say you run Harlem. They say you're some kind of king." He laughed, a dry, disrespectful bark. "Far as I can see, you're just another uppity N in a nice suit hiding behind gunmen." The room froze. Cards stopped mid-air. Dice stopped rolling. Every pair of eyes shifted, first to Sonny Doyle, then to Bumpy Johnson. 9:15 p.m. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't blink. The insult hung in the air, acidic, corrosive, designed to burn. Sonny stepped closer, emboldened by the collective silence. "You hear me?" Sonny pressed, poking two fingers into Bumpy's chest. "I'm a fighter. I take my respect." "You? You got all these boys around you with guns and knives. How about you and me? Right now. Just hands. Man to man." Bumpy raised his hand once. His men froze. He looked down at the spot where Sonny's fingers had pressed against his chest, then slowly brought his gaze back up to the boxer's face. His eyes were calm, his breathing steady. Voice low, almost bored. "You want to fight, Mr. Doyle," he said, using the name like a formality on a death certificate. "You'll get one. Tomorrow. Same time. Sober. You step into my ring. Under my roof." He paused, letting the words settle into the walls. "But after that, you don't speak my name again. Not in my neighborhood. Not in my city." It wasn't a threat. It was an ultimatum delivered like a verdict. Sonny spat on the floor by Bumpy's shoe. "Tomorrow, then. I'll show Harlem who you really are." 24 hours and 19 minutes later, Sonny Doyle would be staring at a hospital ceiling, his jaw wired shut, half his teeth gone, his shattered mouth unable to close around anything thicker than a plastic straw. For the next 20 years, every sip of water, every taste of food, every swallow of humiliation would remind him of this night. The story of how Sonny Hammer Doyle lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to Friday, June 5th, 1959. Sonny Doyle crawled out of Hell's Kitchen the way most Irish fighters did in the late 1940s, hungry, angry, and wrapped in newspaper before he could afford real tape. His father worked the docks until his spine surrendered. His mother scrubbed floors in buildings she would never be allowed to rent. By 16, Sonny understood that in his world, violence was the only currency that held value, and he had plenty to spend. They called him Hammer because his left hook didn't just knock men down, it erased them. 12 straight wins. Knockout after knockout. Madison Square Garden whispered his name. Promoters circled like vultures around fresh meat, promising him destiny wrapped in championship gold. Then came October 1951. The title shot. Sonny stepped into that ring believing he was inevitable. He left on a stretcher, jaw fractured in 2 places, ego shattered worse than bone. The champion had exposed what real fighters already knew. Sonny Doyle had power, but no discipline. Rage, but no control. He was a brawler masquerading as a boxer, and at the highest level, pretending gets you destroyed. The slide was systematic and brutal. Journeyman fights against younger, hungrier kids who saw him as a stepping stone to their own dreams. Gambling became his substitute for the rush winning once provided. Whiskey helped him forget the taste of canvas and the sound of crowds counting him out. By 1959, medical bills from that title fight had multiplied like cancer. Bar tabs stretched across 3 boroughs. Gambling markers were held by men who didn't care about his left hook, only their money. That was when the second-rate white mobsters noticed him. Bronx operators who never sat at real commission tables but understood how to convert human damage into profit. They used him for collections, had him stand in doorways with his fighters' shoulders and dead eyes, his reputation serving as their shield. To keep him loyal and useful, they fed his resentment in carefully measured doses. In dim bars on 9th Avenue, white promoters bought him drinks and poisoned his ears with stories about Harlem. They told him the money up there was soft, that black gangsters were just playing dress-up, hiding behind reputations built on ignorant fear. They mentioned Bumpy Johnson specifically, calling him an uppity Negro in an expensive suit, nothing more than a scared man with gunmen doing his thinking. Sonny listened because it made his failures feel temporary instead of permanent. Meanwhile, Harlem operated under different mathematics entirely. In 1959, segregation wasn't just Southern law, it was New York architecture. Police rolled through black neighborhoods like occupying forces, extracting bribes while ignoring real crime, creating vacuums that men like Bumpy Johnson filled with brutal precision. The city didn't protect Harlem, so Harlem protected itself. Bumpy wasn't a gangster playing community leader. He was a community leader who understood that in a world built on disrespect, only disciplined violence could establish order. His card game on Lenox Avenue wasn't about gambling. It was sanctuary. Bumpy's rules were absolute and non-negotiable. No guns visible, no yelling, no disrespect. Money changed hands in whispers. Inside those walls, chaos had no jurisdiction because Bumpy Johnson said so, and his word was law backed by decades of surgical brutality. Sonny got his invitation through Carmine, a mid-level Italian fixer who wanted entertainment. He thought watching the washed-up Irish fighter embarrass the so-called king might be amusing. When Sonny stepped through that door, he saw Bumpy seated at the center table. Tailored suit, calm eyes, total control radiating like heat from a furnace. Sonny leaned close to Carmine, contempt dripping from his voice. That's him? That's the king? In this room, he wasn't stepping into a ring. He was stepping into a courtroom. And Bumpy Johnson was the judge. The card game had its own rhythm, and everyone in that back room knew the tempo. Jazz bled through the walls from somewhere down Lenox, a saxophone weaving notes that mixed with cigarette smoke and the soft slide of money across felt. Around Bumpy Johnson, respect hung in the air thick enough to choke on. Men spoke when spoken to. Laughter came measured and appropriate. This wasn't chaos. This was ceremony presided over by a man in a tailored suit who never needed to raise his voice to command absolute attention. 8:41 p.m. Sonny Doyle poured his first drink, 3 fingers of cheap gin that burned going down. He watched Bumpy from across the room, studying the way black hands controlled white money, how men leaned in when he spoke, how silence followed his sentences like punctuation. Sonny drank and felt invisible. A piece of furniture pushed against the wall while real power conducted its business. 8:55 p.m. Second drink. Sonny's jaw tightened watching the deference, the quiet nods, the way even well-dressed, educated black men treated Bumpy like royalty. This was supposed to be Italian territory once. Irish territory before that. Now it belonged to a man who never raised his voice. The white hangers-on in the room, men like Carmine, exchanged glances that carried old resentments about empires lost and power redistributed to people who weren't supposed to have any. 9:04 p.m. third drink. Someone at the table compared Bumpy's presence to Sugar Ray Robinson's aura before a fight, the way both men could silence a room just by existing. That comparison landed in Sonny's chest like a blade between ribs. He had fought Robinson once in a preliminary bout, lasted 4 rounds before his corner threw in the towel. Now they were comparing some Harlem racketeer to that kind of greatness, while Sonny sat forgotten in the corner. 9:09 p.m. fourth drink. Sonny stood up. The room's rhythm stuttered but didn't stop. He walked toward the table, each step heavier than the last, fueled by gin and decades of accumulated bitterness. His voice came out louder than the music, sharper than the moment required. "You know what they say about you, Johnson?" The room froze. Cards stopped mid-deal. "They say you run Harlem. They say you're some kinda king." He laughed, the sound ugly and deliberate. "Far as I can see, you're just another uppity Negro in a nice suit hiding behind gunmen." The slur cracked through the air like a whip. Sonny kept going, alcohol stripping away whatever survival instinct he had left. He mocked Bumpy's education, dismissed his community ties as playing Messiah to ignorant masses. "This whole place is a circus," Sonny spat, gesturing at the room, at Harlem itself. "And you're just the ringmaster for a bunch of trained monkeys." Then he stepped closer, into the kill zone. 2 fingers jabbed into Bumpy's chest, punctuating his contempt. He threw fake jabs in the air, shadowboxing inches from Bumpy's face, trying to provoke any reaction, trying to make the king flinch. Bumpy didn't move. His breathing remained steady. His eyes never left Sonny's face, studying him like a surgeon studies an X-ray before making the first incision. When he finally spoke, his voice came low and cold, each word measured like medicine or poison. "You want a fight, Mr. Doyle? You'll get one. Tomorrow. Same time. Sober. You step into my ring, under my roof. But after that, you don't speak my name again. Not in my neighborhood. Not in my city." Sonny backed toward the door, victorious in his own mind. At the threshold, he turned one last time. "I'll break your jaw tomorrow, right in front of your own people." Bumpy reached for his cigarette case, lit one with surgical precision, and exhaled smoke that climbed toward the ceiling. By the time the smoke left his lungs, Bumpy Johnson had already decided exactly how Sonny Doyle would spend the rest of his life. 1:42 a.m. The card game was over, the money counted. But Bumpy Johnson was still awake. He stood in a small kitchen behind the club, shirt sleeves rolled, pouring black coffee into a chipped mug like it was part of some private ritual. The city outside slept, but in this dim space, justice was being calibrated. Across from him, Marcus leaned against the counter, one of the few men Bumpy trusted to hear his thoughts before they became actions. Marcus broke the silence with inventory. A gun in a dark alley, a staged car accident on the West Side Highway, a hospital mishap with the right envelope slipped into the right hands. Each option died in the air before it finished forming, swatted away by Bumpy's slow shake of the head. Bumpy reminded Marcus of his code, not as performance, but as simple accounting of how he operated. He did not kill for sport. He did not torture for pleasure. Every act of violence had a function, punishment, message, protection of order. Nothing more, nothing less. Wild violence was what police blamed on Harlem. Controlled violence was what kept Harlem from devouring itself. "Too easy," Bumpy said, setting his coffee down with surgical precision. He wanted a fight. He begged for it in front of everyone who matters. So he'll remember it as a fight. What Bumpy designed over the next hour was architecture, not emotion. A controlled sparring match in the same back room where Sonny had run his mouth. A real ring erected, ropes tight, canvas stretched proper. Sonny would get exactly what he asked for, twisted into something he would regret every day he continued breathing. The goal wasn't to stop his heart. It was to stop his mouth, to remove his ability to ever boast, ever slur, ever disrespect again without paying a physical tax for every syllable. The audience would be selective and strategic. Influential Harlem businessmen who needed to see that Bumpy's calm demeanor wasn't weakness. A few Italians with real pull, not clowns like Carmine, who needed reminding that crossing into Harlem meant respecting Harlem's king. One or two police sergeants on the payroll, invited not as protection, but as witnesses to the verdict. Everyone present would understand the message when it was delivered. Bumpy ordered his ex-pro boxer Willie to be in the ring earlier that day. Moving. Working the bags. Testing the canvas, adjusting the ropes until they felt like extensions of his own arms. He wanted the space to belong to his side before Sonny ever stepped through the door. Sonny would think he was walking into neutral ground. In reality, every inch would be hostile territory calibrated against him. Marcus asked the question hanging in the smoky air. You gonna kill him in there? Bumpy's eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen wall. Killing is final. Suffering is educational. He asked for hands. He'll get hands. But when I'm done, every word that comes out his mouth will hurt. While Bumpy moved through Saturday with the calm efficiency of a man executing a business plan, Sonny Doyle woke at 11:23 a.m. with a hangover splitting his skull. He stumbled to his bathroom, vomited gin and pride, then looked at himself in the cracked mirror and smiled. Tonight he would embarrass the so-called king in front of everyone who mattered. Easy money. Easy respect. He spent his afternoon in a midtown bar, bragging to anyone still willing to listen about the payday waiting for him in Harlem. Bumpy spent his day differently. He visited the soup kitchen he funded quietly. He made a careful phone call to Dr. Rashad, ensuring the doctor would be available around 9:30 that evening, no questions asked. Not for himself. 8:59 p.m. Saturday. Sonny stood outside the same door on Lenox Avenue, gloves tucked under one arm, suddenly aware of how quiet the street had become. No music, no voices, just the heavy, expectant silence of a neighborhood holding its breath. He thought he was walking into a fight. In reality, he was walking into sentencing. 9 p.m. The last minute of Sonny Doyle's old life. The back room on Lenox Avenue had been transformed into something between cathedral and execution chamber. A regulation boxing ring dominated the center, ropes pulled taut as piano wire, canvas stretched stark white under harsh overhead bulbs. This wasn't a venue for entertainment. This was a courtroom where verdict would be delivered through violence. Chairs lined the perimeter with surgical precision, each occupied by men whose silence carried more weight than any crowd's roar. Harlem business owners sat next to Italian capos. Crooked detectives exhaled smoke beside numbers runners. These weren't spectators. They were witnesses to justice being administered in real time. Bumpy Johnson was already inside the ropes when Sonny arrived. No robe, no satin trunks, no theatrics. Dark trousers and an immaculate short-sleeved shirt revealed arms corded with muscle earned through decades of controlled brutality. His hands were wrapped in white gauze, each layer applied by Willie with professional precision, transforming fists into surgical instruments designed to protect bone while ensuring impact traveled cleanly into flesh. He stood motionless in his corner, not bouncing or warming up, just waiting. This wasn't sport to him. This was procedure. Sonny Doyle swaggered through the ropes at 9:02, trying to fill the oppressive silence with manufactured bravado. He shadowboxed toward his corner, smirking at the stone-faced audience, playing to a crowd that refused to participate in his delusion. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, winked at Bumpy like they were sharing some private joke. Bumpy walked to ring center and spoke without raising his voice, each word carrying to the back row with absolute clarity. No weapons. 3-minute rounds. 1-minute rest. No one steps in unless I say so. It wasn't negotiation. It was law being established by the only authority that mattered in this room. Round 1. The bell was barely audible, but absolute. Sonny lunged forward like a man possessed, fueled by residual alcohol and accumulated hatred. Wild hooks, desperate haymakers, punches designed to erase Bumpy from existence. But Bumpy barely threw anything back. He studied, parried, Blocked. Let Sonny chase him around the ring, burning energy like a man throwing furniture into fire. Every missed punch was a withdrawal from an account Sonny didn't know he was emptying. The sound was controlled, labored breathing, shoes on canvas, leather against forearms. Round 2. Bumpy changed the terms entirely. His punches came measured and deliberate, surgical in their precision. Jab to the mouth. Jab to the mouth. Hook to the jaw. Every strike targeted identical coordinates with brutal repetition. This wasn't about knockouts. This was about dismantling specific architecture. Sonny's lip split like overripe fruit. Teeth began loosening in their sockets, roots protesting repeated trauma. He tried talking between punches, spitting insults through blood and saliva, but the words were changing. More liquid, less sound. Consonants dissolved into wet approximations. Bumpy's eyes never left Sonny's face, each punch a reminder that this wasn't about winning. This was about redefining how Sonny's mouth would function forever. Round 3. The sound changed from wet slap of leather on flesh to dull, sickening thud of impact on bone. Bumpy increased pressure like a vice tightening one rotation at a time. Uppercuts focused on the jaw, testing structural integrity. Hooks came from angles designed to twist the mandible, torque applied with mechanical precision. The rhythm became a sick metronome marking time in fractures. Sonny's legs wobbled, but stubborn refusal kept him upright. His jaw hung slightly wrong, facial symmetry collapsing. He tried to speak, tried to say Bumpy's name, tried to summon one last curse. At exactly 9:23 p.m., Sonny Doyle tried to say Bumpy Johnson's name one last time. What came out wasn't language. It was evidence. His jaw gave way with an audible crack that echoed like a gavel striking wood. The referee had witnessed men die in warehouse fights and back-alley wars, but his hands shook as he waved the bout to a halt. Sonny Doyle didn't fall like a boxer caught by a lucky punch. He collapsed like a condemned building whose foundation had been systematically demolished, one precise blow at a time. The canvas beneath him was decorated with his own teeth, scattered like dice thrown by fate and landing all wrong. His jaw hung at an angle that defied human architecture, mouth unable to close, eyes wide with the terrible awareness that he remained fully conscious, trapped inside a prison of silent agony. Bumpy Johnson stepped back to his corner, breathing steady and controlled, his immaculate dark shirt now spotted with Sonny's blood like evidence of a transaction completed with appropriate precision. He didn't raise his arms in victory. He didn't acknowledge the stone-faced witnesses whose collective silence had grown heavier with each round. This wasn't sport to celebrate. This was correction administered with surgical accuracy. He began methodically unwrapping the gauze from his hands, each layer removed with the same calm efficiency he had used to dismantle Sonny's ability to speak. Dr. Rashad climbed through the ropes with his medical bag, kneeling beside the wreckage with practiced detachment. His examination was swift but thorough, hands moving across the shattered mandible, testing nerve response, calculating structural damage with the clinical assessment of someone who had reconstructed Bumpy's previous lessons. He looked up at the silent witnesses and delivered his diagnosis like a coroner announcing findings. He'll live. Needs massive reconstructive surgery. Tonight. The emphasis on live carried weight. This wasn't accident. This was precision. Bumpy made a gesture barely more than a nod. Marcus stepped forward and placed a folded piece of paper on Sonny's heaving chest, white against the blood-stained canvas. The words written in neat block letters, "Respect is not negotiable." By morning, 5 different versions of that note would circulate through Harlem's streets. Some claimed it contained a list of names and their fates. Others swore it quoted scripture about pride and destruction. The exact words didn't matter. The legend did. The effect was absolute. 6 hours 43 minutes later, Harlem Hospital's emergency surgery bay hummed with controlled urgency. 2 surgeons worked under harsh fluorescent lights, drilling precise holes into bone fragments, threading surgical wire through shattered mandible pieces like mechanics reassembling an engine after catastrophic failure. Metal pins anchored loose sections. Titanium plates bridged gaps where bone had simply disintegrated. In the hallway, a nurse overheard one of the transit cops on Bumpy's payroll whisper to his partner, "Guy's lucky." Another inch of force and he'd be measuring for a coffin. The partner stared into his coffee, understanding that luck had nothing to do with Sonny's survival. While surgeons reconstructed Sonny's face, Dr. Rashad met the girlfriend who had been crying in the waiting area since 10:47 p.m. Her mascara streaked down hollow cheeks, fingers twisted together until knuckles went white. He didn't soften the prognosis. Liquids only for months. Protein shakes through tubes. Even after the wiring comes out, chewing will be torture. The joint damage is permanent. He'll probably need a straw for a very long time. She nodded, but didn't comprehend the mathematics of Bumpy's justice. While Sonny's mouth was being caged in wire and metal, Bumpy sat in a quiet booth at Mama's Kitchen on 132nd Street, settling the bill for 3 exhausted mothers and their children at nearby tables. To them, he wasn't the man who had just systematically dismantled another human being's ability to speak. He was Mr. Johnson, the well-dressed gentleman who ensured their buildings had working heat, who made sure no one bothered them on payday, who asked about their children's grades with genuine concern. The contrast wasn't hypocrisy. It was order maintained through controlled violence and protected through quiet generosity. Word moved through the neighborhood with the efficiency of telegraph wire, carrying not just what happened, but why. The racial slurs delivered in front of witnesses. The public challenge. The chest pokes. The systematic disrespect. And Bumpy's cold, controlled response that left a man breathing but fundamentally altered. The story became parable, warning, and proof of concept simultaneously. 3 days later, when anesthesia finally released its grip, Sonny stared at his reflection in a small hospital mirror. Jaw wired shut. Face swollen into something barely recognizable as human. Dr. Rashad stood beside him, delivering the sentence Sonny could already feel in his reconstructed bones. "You'll need to drink through a straw. Maybe for a year. Maybe longer." It would be 20. The years moved forward, but Sonny Doyle remained frozen in June 1959. By the late 1960s, you could find him haunting the same kinds of rooms, but the rooms no longer belonged to him. Bars with cracked counters where smoke was thicker than money. Back rooms of low-level gyms where old fighters wrapped brittle hands and told stories about nights that no one under 30 cared about. In those places, Sonny sat alone in corners, middle-aged before his time, jaw-heeled crooked despite the surgeon's best efforts, sipping whiskey through a plastic straw like a man drinking from his own verdict. Once, they had called him Hammer. The nickname had traveled through locker rooms and bedding sheets, attached to fear and respect earned through brutal left hooks that erased men from consciousness. By the 1970s, his name survived in different form entirely. He was simply the guy Bumpy took the mouth from, a living cautionary tale that parents invoked when their sons talked too reckless, when ambition outpaced wisdom, when disrespect seemed like a shortcut to respect. He tried telling his version of that night to anyone who would listen. In dim bars, he would corner younger fighters or drifting gangsters, forcing words through reconstructed jaw in mumbled, pained half-sentences that made listeners wince and lean uncomfortably close. He insisted he had slipped. Claimed Bumpy's men had helped, said it wasn't a fair fight. But the words came out twisted and slurred, his tongue working around missing teeth and permanent damage, every syllable a reminder of surgical wire and titanium plates. No one believed the drunk in the corner sipping whiskey through a straw. The only story that survived belonged to Bumpy, carved into collective memory with the same precision Bumpy had used to carve up Sonny's ability to speak. Financial ruin followed physical destruction with grim mathematical certainty. Medical bills from reconstructive surgeries compounded faster than loan shark interest. Fighting was finished at any serious level. His jaw couldn't absorb impact anymore. Fragile architecture held together by metal plates, no match for even journeyman punches. Mob work dried up completely because an enforcer who can't bark orders, who can't intimidate with speech, who winces when forming consonants, is useless as a weapon. Sonny became exactly what Bumpy had designed him to become: reduced, limited, permanently marked. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson's legend grew in the opposite direction, expanding with each retelling until it achieved mythological weight. People told the story not as brutality but as precision justice delivered with surgical calm, racial justice for slurs that couldn't be ignored, social justice for disrespect that threatened community order, personal justice for a man who thought Harlem's king was just pretending. The narrative transformed Bumpy from gangster into protector, from criminal into necessary force, maintaining balance in a world that offered black neighborhoods nothing but neglect and predation. This was the genius of Bumpy's smart violence. Killing Sonny would have been easy, forgettable. A body in the East River is a statistic that disappears with the tide. A man living 20 years with his jaw wired shut is a monument that teaches lessons every day. Bumpy let him live, sentenced him to carry the verdict inside his own reconstructed skull, transformed him into walking billboard advertising the cost of disrespect. Death would have been mercy and closure. Life was education that never stopped teaching. Sonny's final years played out in predictable decline, alone in studio apartments that smelled like old whiskey and older regrets. Health broken by decades of liquid diet and malnutrition, still drinking through straw because solid food remained agony. Every attempt to chew a white-hot reminder of 9:23 p.m. on June 5, 1959. In Harlem, the story became scripture told to young hustlers when they got too loud, to young boxers when they talked reckless about respect they hadn't earned. On June 5, 1959, Sonny Doyle thought a fistfight was about pride. Bumpy Johnson knew better. It was about order. And for 20 years, every sip through that plastic straw repeated the same sentence. Disrespect has consequences. Some got broken. Some got buried. Some got notes saying 2 down, 6 to go. 6 decades separate us from October 1964, yet the Callaway incident remains embedded in Harlem's collective memory like mathematical proof carved in stone. The physical evidence has vanished, Coleman's restaurant demolished, the brownstone on Strivers Row sold to strangers, the Hampton Hotel renovated beyond recognition. But in barbershops and backrooms, the story endures not as history but as urban legend, its specifics blurred by time, yet its lesson preserved with surgical precision. The details shift in retelling. Some place the hotel in Atlantic City instead of the Hamptons. Others misquote the timeline or confuse the newspaper headlines. But the core equation never changes. One mayor disrespected Bumpy Johnson, and within days his entire life collapsed in public. The mathematics of that transaction became legend because it demonstrated a fundamental truth about power that official histories couldn't acknowledge. Bumpy's broader philosophy operated on principles most criminals never understood. Violence was temporary, loud, and invited federal investigations. Information was permanent, silent, and compounded interest over time. The Callaway destruction wasn't isolated but part of a systematic pattern. In 1958, when a real estate developer publicly used racial slurs during a zoning hearing, Bumpy waited 6 months before delivering tax fraud evidence to the heirs and 3 newspapers simultaneously. The developer's company collapsed within 90 days. In 1961, a police captain who brutalized Harlem residents found 18 months of documented protection racket evidence delivered to Internal Affairs. He resigned before charges were filed, transferred to upstate obscurity. Bumpy chose systematic humiliation over physical brutality because he understood that for powerful men, loss of status was worse than death. Violence created martyrs who could be mourned and memorialized. Humiliation created ghosts, living men who wandered through ruins of their former importance, ignored by the world that once courted them. Official histories buried this story with deliberate efficiency. City archives contain no mention of Bumpy Johnson's role in Callaway's fall, attributing the resignation to generic corruption scandal without acknowledging that a Harlem numbers runner orchestrated the destruction. Admitting that reality would require officials to confess that power flowed through channels they couldn't control, that a man without title or office could end political careers with mathematical precision. Callaway's own memoirs, published in 1972, never mention Bumpy by name. He refers only to extortionist elements and criminal intimidation by unnamed figures who manipulated legitimate political processes. The language is bitter, vague, fundamentally dishonest. He couldn't admit the truth, that his own arrogance provided the ammunition for his destruction, that refusing to show basic respect triggered consequences he never imagined possible. The ultimate irony remains breathtaking in its simplicity. Calloway spent 30 years constructing a political dynasty through fundraisers, handshakes, and backroom deals. He built what he believed was an impregnable edifice of power. Yet it all collapsed because of one decision lasting 30 seconds, refusing to take a phone call from Harlem. That moment of casual arrogance triggered a mechanism that had waited 18 months to fire, destroying his marriage, career, reputation, and legacy in the time it takes a camera shutter to close. The mayor who thought he was untouchable learned what every person in Harlem already knew. Bumpy Johnson didn't need a title, an office, or a badge to command respect. He simply needed patience, preparation, and the understanding that every powerful man eventually provides the ammunition for his own destruction. You just have to be disciplined enough to wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. In the end, respect isn't negotiable, it's mathematical. And mathematics, as Bumpy Johnson proved, is always exact.